important to be reminded that the climate crisis is a humanitarian crisis. It is intensifying global humanitarian challenges, as evidenced by the increasing frequency of extreme weather events and its impact on vulnerable communities around the world. The aftermath of climate change is further complicated by, as we all know, the overlapping issues and the intersectionality of issues such as pandemics, political unrest, and economic downturns. As per the IPCC report, over 3 billion people are in areas highly vulnerable to climate change, with the most affected often being in fragile and conflict settings. According to also the IPCC report, it emphasizes that the climate crisis detrimental effects are not evenly distributed. We're all aware, having had the chance, of course, to engage and operate on the ground, we've seen that marginalized communities and vulnerable communities, including women, girls, persons with disabilities, bear the brunt of the impact of the climate crisis. So in the lead up to the COP28 taking place later on this year, inshallah, today's briefing is really an important opportunity to learn of concrete steps being taken on the ground to address this crisis, and also learn of ongoing efforts by the Interagency Standing Committee to strengthen the collective resolve to avert and minimize its impact. With that, I am extremely pleased to be joined today by a distinguished panel that will speak to us about these issues. First, Dr. Jerry Chandler, again, welcome to this session. Jerry Chandler is the Director General of Haiti's Protection Civil Department. A surgeon and medical emergency specialist, Dr. Chandler has extensive experience and leads emergency management efforts to strengthen the capacity of various institutions in Haiti. He holds a pivotal role in the nation's disasters preparedness and response efforts, and a central role in formulating and implementing strategies to mitigate the impact of disasters and coordinate emergency response efforts. Welcome again, Dr. Jerry. Great to have you online. We also are extremely pleased to be joined today by Ms. Mary Ellen McGroarty. She is currently the humanitarian coordinator at Interim for South Sudan and also WFP's country representative. Mary Ellen has many years of humanitarian leadership and frontline operational experience in conflict-affected countries. She served in many duty stations across the globe, including as WFP's country representative in Afghanistan and Chad. Welcome again, Mary Ellen, to this IASC briefing and dialogue. And then also we have on the panel Dr. Matthias Garschagen, who is the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Geosciences at the Ludwig Maximilian University and lead author of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. His research focuses on risk, vulnerability, adaptation, and transformation in the context of environmental and climate change, particularly in cities. Dr. Matthias, great to have you online as well. And I hope Kirsten has joined us. Yes, so Kirsten, lovely to have you online. Kirsten Hagen is a manager in the areas of policy, diplomacy, and disaster law with International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in Geneva. And she's also the co-chair of the Interagency Standing Committee's Climate Crisis Subgroup. Welcome, Kirsten, also to this panel. So colleagues, as with usual practice, we will first turn to our panelists to share a few introductory remarks and thoughts, responding to a couple of questions that we have for them. Before we turn to you, our participants, our audience online, to share your thoughts, your comments, your advice, and your questions. Please do use the chat box to include your comments and your questions there.
In fact, we do have a new video of Kim
If I may just ask colleagues to make sure that their phones are on mute. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so with that and without further ado, let me first turn to Dr. Garschagen, who is again from the Ludwig Maximilian University. Welcome again. So we would like you, Dr. Khashoggi, to set the scene for us, and we'd like to hear from you, from your experience, from your research. What is the human impact of the climate crisis in climate and fragile settings and beyond? And if you can also give us a visual in terms of the forecast for the next few years, the next 5 years, in terms of vulnerabilities and needs, that would be extremely appreciated. So over to you, please, Dr. Khashoggi.
Yeah, thank you, Merit, and thank you, and good day, good afternoon, good evening to everybody around the globe from wherever you're signing in. It's a great pleasure to be here in this important meeting, and congratulations to the IASC's work, of course, on this important front. Exactly, I was asked to talk a little bit about latest findings and climate change impacts, vulnerability. I'll also chip in a little bit of adaptation, what can actually be done about these impacts and vulnerabilities. And I tried to highlight 3 things. So I tried to work my way along 3 questions. Next slide, please. And these are, which risks and impacts do we expect? Where do we stand in adaptation? And what do you know about collaboration adaptation? As I understand it, of course, IASC is also very much around collaboration between different actors in adaptation. So without much further ado, let's move in. What do we know about climate risks and impacts? And I can only highlight a few things. Some of those things will be familiar to you. And I should say that I brought in a couple of slides and a couple of graphics from latest IPCC findings and other publications. These are not meant entirely to be completely grasped now and digested, but sort of a signpost where to find additional information. And I'll highlight just the key findings here. What is very important about this assessment cycle is I think that we find many of the existing risks, and we really, let's start on a very high aggregated level. We really aggregate the global risks into 5 global reasons for concern. You might have seen those: unique and threatened ecosystems, extreme weather events, something that's for the humanitarian sector very, very important, of course, distribution of impact and how unevenly are impacts distributed, global aggregate impacts, do we really run towards or move towards global aggregate crisis, and large singular events. And what's important, these burning embers, a very highly stylized and aggregated depiction of where we stand in risk along a temperature scale on the left-hand side, and then in different risk categories. Very high risk, for instance, means that risk is really pervasive across systems and across the globe. We see that risks become very severe already at 1.1 degree and 1.5 degrees in many of these systems. And very importantly, if you combine or if you compare the latest findings of AR6 to our findings of AR5, then we see that these transitions to high risk are happening sooner than we previously expected. And that is very important to know. We have more information coming in that systems, human systems in particular, also are responding in a more sensitive manner. Risks are becoming more severe at lower temperature scales than previously assessed. Very important thing. So maybe in our programming work in the humanitarian sector also, we have to update some of our scenarios and our assumptions. First key message, I think. Next slide, please. In the IPCC report, of course, you find lots of detailed information on very different sectors. I point out 2 fields that are of course of great relevance to the humanitarian sector, and that is food production, food impacts, here along the example of maize yields and fishery yields. And you see that many of these impacts, in other words, decrease in yield, is already happening very drastically across the globe in low temperatures already. Mehmet was asking quite rightly what is happening in the near-term future, next 10 years, for instance, until we really hit 1.5 degrees. And you see that already at 1.6 degrees, we start to see much earlier than that already, but at 1.6 degrees, very severe decrease in maize yield, also in fishery yield in many of the parts of the world that you are really concerned with in humanitarian work. So for the first time, we really see this is coming together, high vulnerability and high hazards and impacts. Next slide, please. One of the things that maybe the humanitarian sector in the past has not worked so intensively on, but I think it's a huge point for the future, is heat and the exposure to heat extremes. Here, a figure of a recent science paper by colleagues really showing intergenerational justice and global justice in heat exposure. What these 2 maps show you is on the bottom side, first of all, the heat extreme or the exposure to heat waves in a 1.5 world. If you compare the current generation that is currently born to those generations that are already 60 years old and older, and you see amplification factors of 4, 5, 6 and higher, and you see that this is even going much higher up for current climate pledges, so we're steering even to a more imbalanced manner. A lot of this amplification is actually happening in parts of Asia, in parts of Africa, to a lesser extent in Latin America, but here we have, of course, drastic impacts to be expected. For the humanitarian sector, a lot of this is, next slide please, is coming together, of course, in countries where high vulnerability on the left-hand axis meets high state fragility on the right-hand axis. And you see that this is coming together, and we really have feedbacks in vulnerability where high socioeconomic vulnerability and state fragility come together. And next slide, please. And that then leads, if you bring it together with a heat situation, for instance, to a situation where, particularly in refugee camps, we see globally a very uneven distribution of a massively increasing exposure to extreme heat in the next decade. Here depicted temperatures exceeding 35 degrees in the middle of the century, and refugee camps. And a lot of this is coming together in very unfavorable places. In, of course, sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, in other parts of Central Asia. So that is something really to give you one example of these detailed risk assessments, which I kind of view in an overview chapeau presentation here. IDPs and refugees, of course, yeah, to really be having on the agenda. Next slide, please. If we then think about what all of this means for complex risk, the IPCC is very clear in a number of assessments to say risks are increasingly complex. Different risk types really show us already feedbacks that are much stronger than previously assessed. Here, for instance, between heat and then reduced labor capacity, decreased quality of life and food yields, just to give you one example. So that's really something why, of course, and that's not new to you, we need to work together also across different agencies and different sectors. Now, if we move next slide to the next question, and now it's becoming much shorter, where do we stand on adaptation and with adaptation? Next slide, please. Let's consider that risk is typically driven by three factors. The potentially threatening events, like heat waves, for instance, our exposure to them, and our vulnerability to them. Now, if you think about what can be done about all of this, of course, we need to think about all of the three domains. And here, I think in the humanitarian sector, I'm preaching to the choir, of course, by saying oftentimes with the same dollar spent, the biggest impact can be in vulnerability reduction. That is something that to many world leaders hasn't really, and to many planners and risk practitioners hasn't really percolated. Where still the main prominence or the main emphasis is still on hazard reduction. Can we build flood retention zones and flood walls and all of that stuff? But how about social protection systems? How about livelihood diversification? Micro-insurance solutions and so forth. I think that will really, and the IPCC has shown that very clearly, oftentimes will be the more effective things, in particular in the short and medium term, which we never asked for. Why? Because for the short and medium term, the temperature difference, climate impacts and climate hazards will go up anyway. So the big difference is really going to be made in the exposure and vulnerability reduction. Next slide, please. The IPCC then also looked into where do we stand in the evidence that we see globally on adaptation in different world regions. And we're looking into different sectors. You can see that cities, food, health, oceans, poverty reduction, and so forth. And we looked into a couple of core dimensions: the depth of adaptation, how deep does it really penetrate institutional change, the scope, is it being rolled out across different scales, the speed, is it happening quickly enough, and do we hit limits? And all of this together could be characterized as something that we call transformative adaptation. Is really the adaptation up to the job of bringing about the system change that we need in the view of these drastic changes that we see with climate change? And the answer is no. By and large, we are adapting. The world is starting to adapt, and a lot of testing is happening, and very positive things are coming out of it, but it's not happening deeply and quickly and coordinatedly enough. Next slide, please. And that has also to do, and I think that's an important message for the humanitarian sector, oftentimes with the fact that when we do adaptation planning, we consider only the future hazard trends, not so much the future vulnerability and exposure trends, but they are important, particularly as we deal with countries that, for instance, go through massive population changes, massive urbanization changes, agricultural changes, and so forth. So thinking about a climate risk in 20 years from now really needs us to think about also the changes in the vulnerability profile that happened until then. And we see, and we looked into, for instance, all the NAPs globally that are currently published, that this is not very much happening as of yet. So some really work and some communication work to be done. Next slide, and last question in one slide only: where do we stand in collaboration adaptation? Next slide, please. We looked into a big study, and again, the picture is very busy here. Don't try to read it. I'll tell you the main messages, but so you've seen it and then can look it up if you're interested later on in a publication that's just upcoming. We looked into the different actors and which different actors do play which roles in adaptation. And all different actors have to play a different role, and they have to come together, but we see certain profiles. If you look into the bottom part of the picture and you compare the Asia or the Africa and the Europe domains here, And you see in the red color shades that individuals in Africa are mostly the ones that are really adapting, whereas states and governments at local, subnational, and national level play, the blue color shades, in other words, play a much smaller role that is very different in some other parts of the world. What does it mean? What does it tell us? Does it really tell us that oftentimes, for instance, in Africa, small-scale farmers are left to deal with their own adaptation, and that governments are not really, for the moment, bringing about the change? What role do civil society organizations, international organizations play in coordinating and synchronizing and raising awareness for all of this is a big question. But particularly if you compare the individuals and households and the government, I think there's a certain task for us to discuss social contracts for adaptation. How is that coming together? Next slide, I'll wrap up in 3 points with 3 questions, so 3 key points. First of all, risks are stronger and occur earlier than previously assessed. We need to update our risk assessments, very important point also for the short term. The amounts of risk, the amounts of impacts will be larger than previously assessed by and large. Second point, next to hazard trends, adaptation needs to consider future trends in human vulnerability and exposure in order to become more transformative. That's really a big homework for many agencies still. Last point, stronger interaction and participation of different actors is needed in adaptation. And I should maybe say, first of all, an explicit debate about how to distribute the roles and responsibilities that is often lacking as of today. Thanks for your attention. That was a very quick joyride, but I'm happy for questions later.
Thanks a million, Matthias. Again, quite sobering account and forecast of not only what we're experiencing today or what vulnerable communities around the world are experiencing today as a result of the climate crisis, but also projections in terms of what we and they are likely to experience as the impact of the climate crisis intensifies. And thank you for also leaving us with a few important thoughts, especially around updating risk assessments, because the current risk assessments are actually, it seems, to be quite modest in terms of the actual risk that we'll likely face down the road. The importance of bringing in future vulnerability trends into the thinking, not just the future hazard trends, and also the importance of collaboration and participation. Many, many thanks, Matthias. A lot to digest, and I'm sure colleagues online will have quite a few follow-up questions and feedback to share. So with that, I'd like us to go to turn to Dr. Jerry Chandler. Again, Dr. Jerry Chandler is the Director General of Haiti's Civil Department. And to give us a peek and an idea about what is the reality on the ground. And here, Dr. Chandler, would be great to hear from you around the lessons learned and the expectations of governments to better respond to the impact of the climate crisis, including in terms of preparedness and also addressing medium and long-term solutions. So over to you, please, Dr. Chandler.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me loud and clear. Okay, thank you. So yes, indeed, from an operational perspective, us in Haiti, I am the leader of the Protection Civile, which is a disaster management office of Haiti. And as Matthias clearly said, there are impacts, and the impacts are undeniable. Actually, they are gathering data and information to help us understand those impacts and how it works. But like I said, from an operational perspective, we are at the tip of the spear, and we are literally living it, in the sense that loss and damage are increasing. Okay, and it is evident that the communities and countries are experiencing greater and greater loss and damage from climate change, and these impacts are expected to worsen with the increase of global warming. So again, it emphasizes the need for immediate action. And the bigger question for us in Haiti is the fact that is the intersection that this situation has with other risks, in the sense that within the climate change bubble or agenda, you can also see that there are risks, especially for political instability, which we are living in Haiti, and economic shocks. Right now, as we are speaking, we do have a serious gang violence issue that we have to deal with, and Protection Civile is currently handling 24,000 IDPs as we speak. And now it is a very different dynamic for us, because usually, I mean, in the past, we have been at grips with natural disasters, quote unquote, floods and hurricanes and even earthquakes. But now we are dealing with human or man-made disasters, which is even more complex, because the issue is that you don't have a timeline or a systematic, it's not organized. So you know when it starts, you never know when it's going to end. So more and more, it makes the whole disaster response more complex and more challenging. And one of the other key issues is the fact that the frequency and the intensity of the extreme events are, increasing. We are currently in the Caribbean in the hurricane season. We are at the peak of the hurricane season. And 2 days ago, it was scary to see. Actually, we had three different phenomena, moving in the Atlantic. So far, there has not been any significant impact, but at any given time, it can happen. And we're talking about one of those storms, which is Lee, that started, the last weekend and early this week. Well, it started, and oddly, it started as a tropical storm and exploded literally into a Category 5 phenomenon, which is very unheard of. Again, this is to tell you that those things are real, and it is it becomes more and more complicated, which highlights the fact for the preparedness and mitigation, because as of now, we are not prepared, quote unquote, for this type of events and this type of complexity. So in terms of experience from the government of Haiti, what we are looking for, what we are seeking is global action. We are really looking forward to have, for the international community to take comprehensive and swift action to combat climate change. Of course, we're talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and so forth and so on, but also really having tangible results from those, international big meetings, just like the Paris Agreement. We also are advocating for preparedness because, of course, Haiti, like many vulnerable countries, needs the support for building better preparedness and resilience against the climate-related disasters. We're talking about, of course, funding for infrastructure improvement, but also early warning systems, disaster response mechanisms that need to be strengthened, simulation exercises so we can learn from the lessons, so we can be prepared, but also lessons learned workshops so we understand what the experiences were. For instance, we had the 2021 earthquake, which was 7.2 in Haiti. But what we did a lessons learned workshop, and we saw what worked well, what didn't work so well, and we try to adapt so that so that next time it happens, we are better prepared. But in the meantime, we haven't had any quakes, luckily. But now we are dealing with a man-made crisis, which needs to spur another lesson learned, so we can enhance our protocols and procedures. One of the other things that as governments we need to also see is adaptation measures. IT needs to anticipate assistance in developing and implementing adaptation measures to address the impact of climate change on agriculture, infrastructure, especially on the communities, and of course we're thinking about the coastal communities, which are one of the most vulnerable, and especially that we are an island and we are surrounded by the sea. So we need to look into this as long-term solutions, because we need to work on long-term solutions, and we're talking about involvement and implication and harnessing and use of technology, capacity building, technology transfer, and financial support, so we can actually do what's needed, so we can transition to what we call the low carbon economies. Of course, we also we last but not least, we need to talk about inclusive engagement, meaning that, and I'm taking this opportunity once again to make the advocacy for the involvement of the locals. So far, we have been doing that experience in Haiti, where Protection Civile has been at the heart and at the center of the decision-making process. We, on our end, try to pull the communities and put them at the heart of the decision-making process, and this is how we have been able to yield the very little successes that we had. Because and the reason why I say very little is because it's like a matrix. Every time we get a gain, there is something else coming on, and so forth and so on. But still, we are in a dynamic where there are things that are changing and we are yielding results, as small as they may be. So we need to keep that momentum and that dynamic, enhance it, make it better, so we can actually twist the whole dynamic around and be in a different, I would say, a different momentum, so we can actually face those changes and be adapted to all of these changes. So overall, this is what it is. And again, my last point localization, work with the locals, put the locals at the heart of the things, or of the decisions, work with the communities so the decisions can be made with them and by them, so they can teach us and tell us the way to go, and that way we can use the resources that we have, even as small as they are, but we can still use them efficiently and yield correct results for the future. I will stop right there, and I will hand the mic over back to Mervat, and then we will be able to exchange with more questions further down this webinar. Thank you.
Perfect. Many thanks, Jerry. Also, quite sobering to also hear, again, your firsthand experience, of course, in Haiti. Thanks for really putting the spotlight, and again, on an example of some of the challenges in terms of the intersectionality of the challenges of climate with other factors, including, of course, the political situation in Haiti, as well as the economic shocks that are felt there. But equally important is, again, the emphasis that you've put on investing and working with and through communities and local actors. This is absolutely critical, and it's a must. And I know we have still a long way to go as an international community to push the envelope and move the dial on this particular issue. And well copied also on the commitments at the global level, the actions that need to be taken at the global level, including investing in mitigation, adaptation, preparedness, and translating commitments to action in support of local leadership of the response on the ground. So again, Jerry, hugely appreciated. And I'm sure, again, there'll be quite a few questions and comments from colleagues for you later on. With that, I'd like to turn, please, to Mary-Hélène. Mary-Hélène, colleagues, again, is the acting RCHC in South Sudan. She's also the WFP country director, country representative. And here, Mary-Hélène, we would like to zoom in on the IASC's mechanism. So it would be great to hear from you specifically around the coordination structures, the planning and programming processes that better take into account climate risks and ensure a climate-sensitive response. So if you can just give us a visual from your experience in South Sudan, but also in the other contexts that you've operated in, that would be highly valuable. Over to you, please, Mary-Hélène.
Yeah, thank you, Mervat, and really thank you very much for inviting South Sudan to this discussion this afternoon. As you know, the people of South Sudan are really facing a climate crisis that really endangers their peace and security. So it really is one of those countries where the climate is just overlaying with the fragility and everything that, it's a humanitarian emergency and it's a development emergency. It depends on a rain-fed agriculture, on the livestock, but every year the country is now facing more and more severe droughts and more severe floods. It's number 7 in the 165 countries in terms of a percentage of its population exposed to river floods each year. And of course, it's in the top 10 of the countries impacted by extreme weather events. The human cost here in South Sudan is absolutely devastating. Just during periods of rains and flooding, we're just seeing huge numbers of people, displaced from their homes, lives lost, livelihoods lost, pasture lands lost, livestock lost, just investments and previous investments that have been washed away. People are constantly being forced to adapt and move. It leads to increased competition over resources, and conflicts continue to erupt, causing further suffering. For example, during last year's severe flooding, over 900,000 people were affected across South Sudan as the floods just engulfed all the northern states. We have the IDP settlement up in Bentu, the IDP population, the local population, over 300,000 people just surrounded by water, and none of that water receding. So very difficult. Within the humanitarian coordination mechanism, climate is a thematic area because we see it as a driver, we see it as a multiplier, and we see it as an interconnected risk that drives humanitarian needs. And at the moment in South Sudan, it's estimated that over 2/3 of the population needs some form of humanitarian assistance. We are trying to adapt the coordination structures to a nexus approach, but we do acknowledge that we need to relook at how they're arranged and how they dovetail and who is actually at the table, and really echoing what the two previous speakers also spoke about. How do we better leverage the array of technical knowledge available to be able to do more? A coordination mechanism, what we're seeing here in South Sudan for climate action, it must bring together everyone that's involved, you know, the humanitarian actors, the development actors, and of course the peace actors, but most importantly at the center, the people themselves, to identify action and then act. You know, we do acknowledge sometimes as a UN system, we only think as the UN and speak for the UN, and you know, but there is an amazing array of NGOs and international organizations, community-based organizations, and of course the South Sudanese people themselves. So we must have much more conscious inclusion and involvement of them in the engagement on climate and climate action. So it needs to be an inclusive framework, that is an imperative. When we plan, the priorities voiced by the people must be based on their knowledge and should guide when we write about risks, you know, who is facing the risks and how do we incorporate better. And I think, you know, some of the things that Matthias said really touched me in terms of how we need to evolve our thinking around the risks going into the future, because we look at today, but how do we look forward into the future and have that adaptation? We all know, I mean, you know, that humanitarian action is only part of the answer. It's not the solution. It's part of a solution. It's part of a short-term solution to the humanitarian crisis, and certainly only part of a solution to the current climate crisis. So there must be at the table, you know, everyone that's be able to develop the solutions for the people, with the people at the center, empowered to design and implement the solutions. It's a whole of a system approach that's required with the leadership of the government. In South Sudan, we're making some progress around reconfiguring, improving and adapting. The government in 2021 adopted its first national adaptation plan for climate change around the 3 pillars of building resilient communities, economy and development trajectory, and environment and ecosystems. And that at least is informing the work of everyone else around that. And also the government has spearheaded, you know, the sector working group on natural resources, again, to pull together all the activities of all the actors. Around our own community, in terms of the international community, you know, the development, the humanitarian and the peace actors, we've started to come together around what we call the Partnership for Peace, Resilience and Recovery, with climate change and the impact of climate change as one of the key focus areas. I mean, this involves the NGOs, it involves the communities, building up from the bottom, approaches up from the bottom. It dovetails as well with our humanitarian and UN initiative around area-based leadership, where we're looking at, you know, critical geographic areas to be able to drive solutions. And South Sudan is one of the pilot countries for the ERC flagship initiative, which puts the affected populations at the center. We certainly don't have all the answers, and I think we need to also be mindful of not to end up with a plethora of initiatives and forums and platforms, and really to try and think and not to be afraid to break down silos. I mean, of course, the silos around humanitarian development and peace, but also working across the thematic areas to really drive, you know, and close the gaps on mitigation, to close the gaps on adaptation, and to close the gaps on preparedness and response. So I'll leave there. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mary Hélène, and again, thanks for putting the spotlight on the voice of communities that need to be at the center of designing, responding, and making decisions on what is the best and most suitable way to avert and minimize the impact of the climate crisis. But also noting that the humanitarian response and the humanitarian community is part of the solution, but is not by any means the only actors to be engaged in this dialogue or to respond to the impact of the climate crisis. So also refreshing and good to hear that in South Sudan, there are efforts to bring in other critical actors to the efforts to address the impact of the climate crisis, including development actors, peace actors, and others, because this needs a joined-up approach, and also reassuring to know of the government national adaptation plan, which is really at the heart of efforts, and it's really galvanizing the response of the different actors on the ground. Many thanks again, Mary-Hélène. A lot to reflect on there, and I'm sure also there will be many comments and feedback from the colleagues online. So with that, I'd like to finally turn to Kirsten Hagen, who once again is the co-chair of the IASC's Climate Crisis Subgroup, and she's also a manager in IFRC in the areas of policy, diplomacy, and disaster law. And Kirsten has done tremendous work in the world of the IASC, really crafting the position of the IASC, the efforts of the IASC in collaboration, of course, with the IASC partners to define what can we do as a community to better prepare and respond and address the impact of the climate crisis, especially also in the lead up to COP28. So with that, Kirsten, I'll just turn to you if you can give us a good overview around the efforts of the IASC and what are the key messages and the preparations we're making ahead of COP28. Over to you, please, Kirsten.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Mervat, and hoping my sound is working. So thank you so much. Really honoured to be part of such a fantastic panel. And just listening and watching, Matthias, I love those slides. They're incredibly striking. And in particular, looking at the heat impacts on refugees, and I'm presuming also on IDP communities as well, incredibly significant. And also looking at your map made me think about some of the challenges we're seeing in terms of a lack of investment in adaptation in a lot of, particularly in fragile states and in particularly vulnerable states, and just how those two maps might overlap. I also thought this final slide, or one of the later slides in terms of who is doing the work on adaptation, and that most of this is being done by households in a number of countries, was incredibly compelling and a really, really significant piece of information. And I think we all know this because we know that, you know, when you have any kind of a disaster, a crisis, you know, who is it who responds? The first is the individuals, the families, the communities, then it's the local organizations, as Jerry was saying, and then finally it's the humanitarian organizations when it's really significant, but coming in often a lot later. So I think that's really critical. And I also really liked the points that both Jerry and Mary-Hélène raised about risks overlapping with other risks and other shocks. And you know, one thing happens and then another happens, or they both happen at the same time. So what we as the IASC are trying to do is to take this point that Mary-Hélène raised about humanitarian action being part of the solution and trying to work out what that means. What is our role and how can we do it well? And these are the issues that the IASC is trying to grapple with. And of course, the humanitarian sector has been responding for quite a while to extreme weather events in particular. And these challenges in this work has really driven some important changes in the humanitarian sector, such as development of flexible funding tools or enabling anticipatory action and forecast-based financing and additional work so we can respond before a disaster strikes. Another really important initiative is the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations that now has over 370 signatories, as well as some 12 state partners who are there supporting implementation by humanitarian organizations. So the IASC has tried to step up to the plate here by recognizing climate change as an urgent area of action, prioritizing it as part of the strategic priorities, and establishing a climate subgroup, which IFRC co-chairs with OCHA. And I also want to flag here that we have a sort of a leadership group as well that is FAO and IFRC. So you're seeing FAO, IFRC and OCHA trying to come together and really drive this. But there are a lot of really important members of the IASC group that have really been contributing in incredible ways to a lot of the work we're doing. So just important to flag, none of this is any one, two or three organizations. It's really a collective effort. So the subgroup was given two main responsibilities. The first was around practice and the second was around policy and advocacy. And we were tasked to put together a roadmap for action and then an advocacy plan for coordinated engagement in critical processes. So in terms of the practice side, the idea of this roadmap is to really work out how we can collectively support scaled up climate action in countries in crisis. And so there's been a lot of work already. I think it's actually really excellent to flag in terms of greening the humanitarian sector. Noting there was recently this guidance on environmental responsibility and humanitarian operations, not produced by us, but I want to flag it because I think it's really excellent. And what we've been looking at specifically is what are the barriers and opportunities to scaling up climate action. And that includes an understanding of climate risk, as was flagged by a couple of the previous speakers, as well as a knowledge of climate action and programming that would build climate resilience and how we can better integrate this into our work and how we can work together, be it as clusters, be it as an HCT, just be it as a humanitarian community working with others, be that government, development actors, and so on. So the group has developed a survey and held a number of consultations, and the survey has been rolled out, I think, so far in Honduras, DRC, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Philippines, and Fiji through the ICCGs. And I can actually put the link to that in the chat in case there are organisations on this call that might be interested in also filling out that survey. The idea is to collate inputs from the survey and from some of the focus group discussions that have been held in those particular focus or example countries, and then based on those ideas in terms of the barriers and the opportunities to put together a roadmap for action. And so on that, I'd just like to say to everyone on the call, we'd really like to have your inputs. And I think I'm turning into a broken record because I said this a few days ago to a group of member states also at a briefing in the UN. So on the policy side, the IASC members have been working together to really raise awareness of the humanitarian impacts of climate change. So that's been at intergovernmental meetings such as ECOSOC-HAS, at UNGA, also though in the UNFCCC processes, so the climate processes. And the teams developed an advocacy plan, a common narrative, key messages, and really tried to increase our coordination. What's of particular interest, and I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail now, but I'm really happy to answer questions on this, is we've worked to develop a common approach on loss and damage. And so loss and damage is effectively the impacts that are experienced because of climate change. So this is slow onset and extreme weather events. The loss refers to things that are lost permanently, so lives, species, territories, water sources, ecosystems, heritage sites, and so on. Whilst damage refers to those things that are affected but can be restored in theory, so homes, schools, health centres, and so on. And these are determined economic or non-economic losses. And so what's an interesting point to be aware of is that this issue, which for us is the humanitarian impacts of climate change, was not always part of the formal COP agenda, but it is now on the formal COP agenda since last year. And so we've really been trying to engage much more actively in this conversation. And so in terms of engagement, and this is my final point now, so we can go to some of the really interesting questions that I've been seeing popping up in the chat, is that humanitarians, IASC members, have been getting far more engaged and far more visible in the climate conversations, which is really critical. So IFRC, we've been turning up to the UNFCCC COPs for close to 20 years, and we used to be this kind of lonely voice. And now we're definitely not a lonely voice. There are so many humanitarians that are there and are speaking out. It's actually really encouraging, and we just need to coordinate that and really leverage that opportunity. The group has organised side events, discussions such as on the role and limits of humanitarian action in responding to loss and damage. We've also been attending what's called the Transitional Committee on Loss and Damage. So that's where there's been discussions around how to set up a fund for loss and damage and to contribute to funding arrangements. And a critical piece here, and I think a common message to this group has been, we're really happy to explain how humanitarian funding works and how it's relevant, but it is not the solution. We are not the solution. This is not something we can do alone. We want to contribute, we want to help, but there is so much more that is needed, and we are very conscious of the huge gaps in terms of type of action, scale of action, location of action, and who is getting what they need. And so these gaps we want to contribute to resolving, but we cannot be the solution to what is happening with the climate crisis. Some of these organisations, the IASC members, have been asked to have been part of the technical support unit for this discussion. And then we've all been trying to come together in terms of common messages, information sharing, and coordinated events. And so again, really keen to get inputs, not only to the roadmap, but also in terms of how we can do this better, help us to share information and opportunities. And then one final point that I wanted to raise is this year, the COP28 presidency, which is the United Arab Emirates, they've actually established a Relief, Recovery and Peace Day, as well as health, as well as food, food, agriculture and water. Wow, I can't speak properly today. And these are really important opportunities, particularly I would say the health, relief, recovery and peace, because that hasn't been there before. And the COP28 presidency has been reaching out to the humanitarian community and saying, tell us what the gaps are, tell us what the needs are, tell us where we can, outside of the negotiated outcomes, really elevate action to bring about change. And so a couple of critical issues that have come up in those conversations that it's just worth flagging. One is around getting climate finance and climate action to the community level in fragile and conflict affected states and states that are getting left behind when it comes to investment in adaptation. So that's been one critical piece. Another critical piece has been really about scaling up early action and in particular getting pre-positioned financing in place so that it's possible to act before a crisis. One of the issues we've been raising is this point around locally led adaptation or locally led action in the climate space. And then they're also calling for a package of solutions. So they're really seeking ideas and commitments of who's going to do what to address some of these fundamental issues. So I'm hoping this can be a big opportunity that we can really make the most of, because it's quite unique and hopefully it's the beginning of a process, not the end of one and not a one-off. Thanks so much, Mervat. Back to you.
Thanks a million, Kirsten, and thanks again for flagging the opportunity at the COP this year. I will take this as an open invitation, Kirsten, from you to the colleagues who have joined us online, in addition to the great ideas, of course, that yourself and other IASC members are pulling together to make sure that our asks or the messages that we'll be relaying at COP28 are clear, including, as you mentioned, on climate financing, around scaling up early action, locally led adaptation, and so on, that there are other ideas also that colleagues online who are at the front line that they can also share with us to inform this. So the colleagues, please, build on this opportunity. Any ideas, any thoughts, any suggestions are welcome, because this is really the right time and it's a great opportunity to influence these discussions. So again, huge thanks to all of our panelists. I can see the chat box. There's quite a few comments, and thanks for the panelists who have already responded to some of the questions there. But maybe I will kick off with the first question to Matthias. And there's, of course, a lot of interest and intrigue with the slides that you have shared. There's a particular question on this last slide regarding differentiated adaptation strategies and lack of support in vulnerable countries. If you can just maybe elaborate on that last slide, and of course, you're welcome to project it again so that colleagues can refer to it, that would be fantastic. And then from there, I'll turn to Mary-Hélène, please. There, it would be great if there is an opportunity to shed light on the UN mechanisms to facilitate climate financing for humanitarian crises or to support humanitarian response efforts. If you have any visual, any experiences, any best practices, any advice on that can inform responses in other contexts and colleagues being online, that would be really extremely helpful. So we'll kickstart with these two questions, and then we'll go ahead and ask the other panelists the questions that are as they come in. Over to you, please, Matthias.
All right, thanks. Thanks a lot. Thanks for all the interest and for the fellow panelists. That's really exciting and a lot of interesting stuff. I mean, what we discuss is not so exciting in terms of it's actually rather daunting, but it's good that we come together and discuss it. So there was a question on this slide in particular, and I think it was saying it was surprising that civil society had a smaller role to play in adaptation, and it would be interesting to know how, which types specifically are there in civil society and so forth. Maybe just I should have said this maybe a little bit more clearly. What we see here in front of us is not so much the normative in terms of what should different actors do, but it's more the observational. What have we observed in a global review of adaptation activities reported in the literature? What do we see? Which actors are mentioned and in which roads are they discussed? And that's, of course, a big disclaimer already, because there is a very hard to predict bias. Not everything that makes it into the academic literature is, or let's say the academic literature doesn't fully meet reality. But, and we discussed this in the paper at quite some detail, how it needs to be triangulated with other data sets, of course. But with massively increasing adaptation scholarship at the same time, this is one out of many important data sets and fields, I think. That just is a disclaimer. What we see here just very quickly is then a smaller role being reported for civil society organizations. So in adaptation that is currently being reported in, adaptation projects around the world, civil society organizations play a significant role, but not as large as governments and households. And I think that's not surprising. We could go into a little bit more detail into the differences of international civil society organizations, such as some of us are here from the panel, and then local civil society organizations and how they play different roles, which comes to local awareness raising more with the local ones, coordination of work mostly with the multinational ones. I think that's also not very, very surprising. We haven't looked into greater detail into, I think the question was going into women's groups and so forth. We haven't specified down to that level, but I'll note it down. It's surely something for future research, but we should also see that these global overviews, I think, can only give you so much in terms of resolution. Yeah. I'll stop here. I think the most important point is this is not the normative, the aspirational, this is the observational of what is there currently. I think that's a very important differentiation to make. Thanks.
Many thanks, Matthias. And with that, we'll turn swiftly to Mary-Hélène, please. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. This is not an easy one. I think funding in fragile contexts are certainly is one of the biggest gaps, no matter what it's for, right? Because I mean, that fragility, comes with certain characteristics, right? That certainly hamper the funding. I think we need to look at ways that, despite probably central fragility, that we don't forget the periphery and we don't forget the communities, and we need to find more localized financing models, whether it's through trust funds or something that allow so that people, where I see it, and particularly in the countries where I've worked at, so you don't have this collective punishment, which is what I call it, because of certain characteristics and fragility and security around countries. So it's looking at what are the alternative models that we can come up with, so that the funders, the donors, get the reassurance that they need in terms of delivering the impact being delivered on the ground, and how we channel funding. I mean, if you look at places like South Sudan, they don't get a huge amount of the green climate funding and stuff like that because of how the models are developed. So I think we need to get more bolder and braver around coming up with models that really put communities and build localization and build from the bottom up towards, and not penalizing overall because of that that characterization around fragility. And then is it trust funds, is it different financing mechanisms? But I think some innovation around there is certainly required.
Thank you, Mary-Hélène. And again, I invite also our distinguished panelists, other panelists, to come in if there are also additional thoughts or responses, creative responses that you might have to address the climate financing question. That would be very welcome. Kirsten, please go ahead.
I think this is a really critical question, and just for those who haven't necessarily been following that issue, if you look at the mapping of who are the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, and then you look per capita at climate adaptation finance, there is a clear set there of countries that are being left behind. And then if you try and ask why, one clear reason is around fragility, conflict affected and crisis affected. And I think to come up with the solutions, we really need to understand the sort of the mechanisms and the problems. And basically, climate finance is large amounts of money. They come very slowly through a very bureaucratic process. They require a significant capacity to manage them, and they go to a very narrow range of stakeholders. And this is completely diametrically opposed in many ways to humanitarian financing, that while we might complain about it and critique it and want to improve it, it is much faster, much smaller amounts of money, much greater diversity in terms of who it can go to and how it's delivered. And so there needs to be some way of bridging that gap, because suddenly a small local NGO that delivers excellent humanitarian programs isn't going to suddenly be able to take on a multi-million-dollar grant. So we're not going to be able to just change that overnight. It's about trying to find alternate pathways, smaller volumes of grants, fast, different levels of risk. And so thinking about how can we, make the amount smaller and the risk appetite slightly higher? Can we find a diversity of actors to provide that funding through? And it's not necessarily that the solution will be using humanitarian funding mechanisms. There may be a wide variety of solutions, and maybe about new funding mechanisms. It may be about changing some of the climate funding mechanisms. And so, for example, we've heard colleagues from the GCF who've created a specific window for local organisations where they've found intermediaries who can pass on the funding. But then they've said, oh, we've only got a couple that are registered, so we've now maxed out how much money we can transfer onto local partners. So we also need to be part of this solution as well in brainstorming some of those critical challenges, and also thinking about what are the critical principles of any funds or funding arrangements, including ensuring goes to the local level, gets to the community in need, it's fast enough to meet the needs that are there, and so on. And I saw that Jerry, I think, had his hand up and wanted to jump in, so apologies if I talked too long there.
No, please go ahead, Jerry. And then I also see there's one hand from the audience, Manuel Marquez, so we'll turn to Manuel in a second, but please over to you first, Jerry.
No, I just wanted to build up on what Kristen and the other fellow panelists said. And indeed, we need to be creative about getting the funding and also using the funding, because we're talking about capacity building. We're talking about a lot of actions on the ground, but we need to keep an eye on the holistic vision of the action. And from my experience right now is that despite all the orientations that we have, we are still focused on response, whereas we need to focus more on preparedness, on prevention, on mitigation, and capacity building. And this is to also say that it is a pyramid. It comes from the top and goes all the way down. But as Kristen said, it can be very complex and daunting in terms of mechanisms and how to do it. So again, we need to be creative about how to do it. We need to be able to make sure that it lands, quote unquote, it reaches where it needs to reach. And of course, it needs community involvement and engagement in order to actually land and have impact, but have impact from a strategic standpoint. See it through the lens of the Sendai framework, see it through the lens of the various accords that we have pledged towards, so we can actually reach those thresholds that we have agreed upon to actually twist the dynamic around. Over.
Many thanks, Jerry. So I'd like to turn again to Kirsten, because there is a good question specifically on if there are any examples, Kirsten, that you can share with us, and I'm sure you have many, around locally led community engagement tools. So if you can share any based on, again, of course, IFRC and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement's work on the ground, that would be helpful. Again, this is an opportunity to share best practices as well. And then I'll turn, if it's okay with you, Jerry, perhaps to you on the gender dimension of the impact of the climate crisis. So what are you seeing in Haiti? How are you seeing the climate crisis compounding and deepening the impact on women and girls, but also other critical marginalized or vulnerable groups such as persons with disabilities? So maybe first to Kirsten, and then we'll turn to Jerry, please. Over to you.
Thanks. And just to note, I think there's a hand up. I think it's Manuel who wants to add something or ask a question as well. So I'm sorry, I actually misread this question in the chat, and I thought it was about locally led climate action, and it's not. It's about locally led community engagement tools. And I would have to say on this, I am not the expert by any sense. And we have a lot of community engagement and accountability colleagues, or those working on accountability to affected populations, who I think could answer this so much better than I. I don't know if there are any of them on the call who might also want to jump in or share something. On my side, what I've shared into the chat is actually the work that we've done on locally led climate adaptation. And I think a critical piece of that is absolutely about the community engagement, because without the community engagement, you need to work with them to understand risks. The community needs to be part of designing their solutions. They ideally should be leading them. I mean, think about an early warning system. Unless you have a community designed action plan that says this is how we're going to identify and warn the most vulnerable people, this is how we're going to move them out of harm's way, this is where we're going to build the evacuation shelter, this is how we're going to encourage, like all of these different pieces, then you're actually not going to save lives, and it's not a functional early warning system. And so I think this piece is really critical, but I don't feel like I'm the best person to be sharing this because my focus is more on the climate side. So I'm hoping there are some experts who want to put something in the chat around that one.
I'm sure that will be the case. Thanks, Kirsten, for giving this a shot. And Manuel, sincere apologies for the oversight. If you don't mind, Jerry, I'll just hand the floor to Manuel for his comment or question, and then I'll come to you with the gender question. Over to you.
Thank you, Mervat, and all. No, it's just to add, I cannot agree more. Apologies. Manuel from IOM, the head of Division of Climate Change at IOM, is just to put a different hat. I am the co-chair of the subgroup under the Secretary General agenda on displacement that looks at prevention and climate, that will generate messaging for the entire system on these. But I wanted to just make an appeal here, and I'm very happy to have seen Matthias' graphic, that famous annex on HIT, because I think that needs to be one of the things that everyone in this call needs to go and look for and digest. Those black areas on that map mean that more than 100 days a year, those locations will be above 35 centigrade. This is catastrophic, not only for the living conditions of people, but to the ecosystems where we live. And if we think those people are IDPs and refugees, then this is a paradigm shift to the way and the methodologies that we are applying to deliver and what kind of delivery of humanitarian assistance we are doing. But my appeal is, there is the global stocktake under UNFCCC taking process and the global goal on adaptation. It would be very important that humanitarians submit case studies to the global stocktake with the concerns that we have on the impacts of climate change on humanitarian assistance and the future of humanitarian assistance. And the UNFCCC is using artificial intelligence to summarize all of this. So we need the volume of the concerns, including solutions for adaptation, including ideas on addressing loss and damage and other things, or mitigation of emissions. And the more humanitarians contribute to this exercise, the stronger will be the summary of this and this reflection. And to end, it's just to put in context that the global architecture on finance for climate asks 100 billion a year to address all arms: adaptation, loss and damage, mitigation. And humanitarians in 2023 asked $55 billion to address all humanitarian crises, many of them interlinked with climate. It's a fifth of what is agreed to be given to the most vulnerable countries. So there is a competition for resources, and we need to help expand the understanding on these and channel the right resources. The humanitarian system of the future cannot cope with this pressure. So please submit to the global stocktake, and let's try to help find pathways to address these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. And again, this is exactly the type of interventions and solutions that we're eager to hear in these types of dialogue. So thanks for extending the invitation. I'm sure we will jump on this opportunity from the side of the IASC to contribute to the UNFCCC global stocktake. So thanks again for highlighting this point. So maybe with that, I'll turn back again to Jerry, if you don't mind. Jerry, if you can share some insights on the gender dimension of the climate crisis, and also in terms of impact on other vulnerable and marginalized communities. And then afterwards, I'll turn to Mary-Hélène, if you don't mind, Mary-Hélène, just to also, if there is an opportunity, if you have a visual of that, to shed light on how climate analysis is informing the HPC process, so needs assessments, response plans, because I know there's a bigger question in the chat box around the GHO, the upcoming GHO that'll be launched later this year. And I know our colleagues in OCHA are working very hard to make sure that the climate aspect and the analysis of the risks are well defined there. And it will be important, Matthias, perhaps, to put you also in contact with the colleagues that are working on the GHO. So I'll take this on as a follow-up action from my end as well. But But if any thoughts, Mary-Hélène, from South Sudan, on how you're bringing in the climate aspect and analysis into the HPC process, which is the humanitarian program cycle process, would be greatly appreciated. So, sorry, Jerry, long introduction, but back to you again. Over.
Thank you, Mervat. But yes, the question is very relevant. The question regarding the vulnerable groups, especially the balance in regards to how the impact of the climate crisis is on these groups, and also the gender balance approach to it. As you guys certainly know, vulnerable groups are getting the brunt of the shock. I mean, they're getting the bulk of it, and they're the ones that pay, quote unquote, the most consequences of these shocks. And if I go back to the current example of the current crisis in Haiti, part of the lessons learned that we had from the 2021 earthquake was to be more proactive and to work more with these groups and to anticipate, the issues that they would be facing as part of an impact or that would come. It's just that now we are dealing with a man-made crisis. So right now we have to deal with a lot of GBV, gender-based violence issues on the ground, and it is more and more, an issue. So what we did is that we activated our groups for protection earlier, and we have a few organizations that are there that are helping us on those improvised sites to monitor gender-based violence and also work in all the aspects of protection, gender-based violence, children protection, and so forth and so on. But also we also think of those with the vulnerable ones with mobility difficulties and this type of issues as well, because they are a lot of times left behind, and they do not, they cannot necessarily benefit from the work that we need to do. And of course, you also know that women are a great proportion of the active and productive population of Haiti. So right now, the idea for us is to actually go, as I said before, go from a reactive effort where we are handling that in response towards activities and programs that are oriented towards these groups, so that they can be better prepared, so that they can be, so that they can actually be involved and be part of, all this mechanism of preparedness, strengthening, but also response. Because, and right now in Haiti, I can tell you that with the Ministry of the Rights of Women, we have started and initiated a few activities, but it's definitely not enough. And as I said, we need to get out of the reactive stage so we can strengthen those groups. One of the solutions, for instance, for us at Protection Civile is to actually involve and have more and more women volunteers as part of our response apparatus. This is the first step. We get them on board, and they can actually help us work, specifically in the response, but also work and make the awareness, public awareness efforts, so people know that the most vulnerable need to be tended for first. They need to be cared for, and they need to be taken into account in distributions, in actions of response, but also in preparation, so we can be in a better situation whenever this type of issues occur. Like I said, again, there are efforts being made, but we are still making baby steps. We need to go further, we need to go faster, and we need to have funding in regards to those specific vulnerable groups, so we can prepare, and have them in a better position before something happens. As I said, we're not right now in the midst of the hurricane season. A hurricane might strike, so the people need to know that who they need to prioritize, how they need to prioritize, how they need to protect them, so they can be part of the efforts that we do, and they can benefit in terms of literally in terms of priority, so they can benefit from the efforts that are being done. Over.
Very much appreciated, Jerry. Really appreciate it. And with that, I'll turn to Mary-Hélène, please.
Yeah, thank you. 4 or 5 years of unprecedented flooding in South Sudan has really spurred on the use of climate analysis in defining the humanitarian needs, but also in also looking forward a little bit on the risks. I mean, it's a key part of many of the assessments that we are doing, you know, particularly around food security, around displacement. But we also have a risk map as well when we look at the risk of flooding, we look at the risk of displacement, we look at the risk drought. So it's been incorporated, though. However, you know, in some of Matthias's presentation, he did give us some food for thought. I mean, how do we do a bit more forward-looking, particularly as we want to look at more at you know, when you're looking at anticipatory action, mitigation, prevention, and everything else. But it's becoming. We have done a lot of work in South Sudan around it, but largely driven because of the context that we are in. But again, it is a work in progress as we move forward. Over.
Thanks, Mary Elaine. And before I wrap up, and I recognize we have 4 minutes to go and we're doing well on time, if there are any key points perhaps from our panelists or any final questions from our participants online, please, this is the moment to do it. So maybe just doing a quick round of closing points, brief closing remarks from our panelists, first turning to Matthias, then Jerry, then Mary Elaine, then Kirsten, before we wrap up. Over to you, please, Matthias.
Yeah, thanks. I don't even know where to start, but I'd like to, if I had to choose one, I would like to pick up the point that Jerry made out of the many very relevant points in my view. I think he quite early on actually highlighted, you know, these shocks, these crises will be coming not only more deep, but more often. And I think that's, of course, something. Is that only a matter of quantity, or will that term change the quality of recovery, of vulnerability, but also of fundraising, and how the world is actually ready to respond to this? You quite rightly mentioned, you know, the $100 billion goal and so forth is not even met. Will we see saturation with these things? If we see, just take a look what happened this year. You know, if so many of the crises come and see it, certainly in my part of the world here, maybe there's a certain saturation on the donor side kicking in, certainly in the public, I should say. I think that's something also to think about. So when we, and I'd like to tie this into the thinking of future vulnerability, thinking of future trends, not just in terms of hazard maps and climate scenarios and so forth, but also how will the world actually respond to this? And I think that's something for us jointly maybe to think about. Probably many on the panel and in the audience have thought about this or you've thought about this in your programming work and so forth. I think for science, we still need to pick that up. Is there going to be a qualitative change in how the world actually responds to this, and maybe to the detrimental? We're calling for more and more, but maybe the opposite direction is actually happening because we see these crises happening so frequently. So I think that's a very fundamental point that Jerry made very early on, to really think about the bandwidth of responses that could happen to that. Yeah? So I think that's not so easy. No?
Thank you, Matthias. With that, turning to Jerry, please.
Thank you all for having us today, and I think it is a very good. Those topics are very important to discuss, and again, I'm taking the opportunity once again to advocate once again for the implication of locals and the communities. Like I said before, there are efforts that are being made, but we need to enhance them. We need to, push more, quote unquote, and be more decisive. And in order to actually yield more results, we need the people that are involved, the people at the heart of, the decision making. They need to be part of that bubble, and they need to be part of the decision making process. They're the ones that know. They're the ones that are actually going to benefit from it, and they're actually the ones that actually, if they don't understand it, well, it's not going to work. Basically, if I can summarize it like this. So again, state level, government level, local level, community level, definitely have them on board. Even if they work through NGOs, it still can work and it can be efficient, but make sure that we're all part of that whole process. And this is what we've been doing in Haiti. Like I said, we're making baby steps, but it is coming through. Over.
Great way to conclude, Jerry, and the message is received very loud and clear. Thank you, Jerry. With that, turning to Mary Elaine, please.
Yeah, I think as we need to break down the silos around the coordination. We need to get beyond talking, of course, and get to real action keeping the people at the center, but we also need to look at the funding mechanisms. You know, when you see the devastation in South Sudan that it is wrecking, you know, how do we really get the localized, you know, funding down to the local level? You know, really what Christina was talking about, and coming through and looking forward. I mean, I walk away startled a little bit with some of the stuff that Matthias also delivered. You know, we need to be, as we look at today, we also need to be looking forward on what's coming at the most vulnerable people in the countries where we work.
Great, many thanks, Mary-Hélène. Kirsten?
Sure. Sorry, just trying to work out how to come off mute. You'd think I'd have worked this out after how many years of COVID and doing different calls. I just wanted to actually finish by trying slightly to answer one of the questions in the chat, where the person who raised the question flagged that adaptation and mitigation are considered much more part of the development agenda. So what's our role, and can we, I'm reading this as, can we act in additional places, in places that are prone to disasters without necessarily, I guess, going a bit broader than our current humanitarian mandates? And I think there's a few points for this. I mean, the first piece is, in terms of mitigation and adaptation, we all have a certain responsibility in terms of ensuring we're not at least contributing to the problem. And so that goes across the board. We're not necessarily mitigation actors in that we're going to go out and resolve issues around fossil fuels, but we can certainly reflect on ourselves. There is a piece here around the fact that different organizations may have a humanitarian role, but may have a much broader mandate. So they may be both humanitarian and development, or there may be local actors where, to be frank, what you call it doesn't matter. It's about meeting community needs. I think there is a piece, though, around ensuring that whatever we do in our humanitarian action around the sort of disaster risk management cycle, that it's climate smart and it's risk informed. Are we building a refugee camp in a flood zone? That's crazy. Are we, you know, if we're building back better, building back for what? Are we going to build back presuming that the next flood is going to be the same, or it might actually be bigger? So it's really thinking through how to make our work sensible and so that it works for the future. And then I think the final piece is, it's not about us, it's about how we work with others. And I think this is a point that Mary-Hélène also said quite clearly. It's about how we work in collaboration with others, the development actors, the climate actors, the peace actors, the human rights actors, the governments, whoever it is, to say what are the gaps and who is best placed to fill them. It doesn't need to be us, but let's work together to fill those gaps and find a solution through that collaboration.
Great. Many thanks again, Kirsten. Many thanks, Matthias. Many thanks, Jerry. Many thanks, Mary-Hélène, and also the colleagues who have worked behind the scenes to make this briefing possible, including Merlinda with the IC Secretariat, as well as Yassine with the IC Secretariat. I'll just maybe use this opportunity to do a perhaps just shed light on a recent report that OCHA produced on the extreme heat report, and I know our colleague Greg Pooley has uploaded it online. Please take a look at it. Quite revealing and also sobering. I think, you know, all the panelists have really concluded the session very nicely by highlighting again the importance of local response, building local capacity, investing more in preparedness activities. The starting point is communities, local governorates, local governments, and of course, what can the international community do to enable and empower and capacitate local actors to continue to do the amazing work that they're doing at the front line to deal with this difficult situation. The point around analysis is also a very important one. Thanks, Matthias, for sharing these great, you know, slides and giving us a visual on the IPCC report. I think this is really, again, quite important, and it speaks to not only breaking the silos between the humanitarian development, human rights, peace, and climate actors, but also the fact that we need to do more in partnership with colleagues such as yourselves and other critical think tanks to make sure that our analysis and the forecasts are as spot on as possible, so that we're much better prepared to respond to what's coming, what we're confronting now, but also what's coming next. Again, colleagues, huge thanks for the time. I know this is not an easy topic, but it's an important topic, and I'm sure we'll have other opportunities, especially in the lead up to COP, but post-COP, to make sure that we translate a lot of the great ideas that we've talked about, including on localization and on financing, from ideas and commitments to reality and shifts on the ground. Many thanks, colleagues, again, and thanks for all of the participants for joining us today.
Thanks. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Mervat, for facilitating.